Thank you. So I think we'll get started now. I'm really excited to be moderating this panel, the Protecting Workers in the Face of a Changing Society. And we have three wonderful panelists. So just to give a brief overview, as I hope many of you are probably aware, conditions for employees in all lines of work, from academia to agriculture to utilities, are increasingly precarious. And we see that in workers facing underpayment for all of the really dangerous conditions that they're facing during the pandemic, through lower and lower rates of health insurance and companies finding ways to wiggle out of giving workers these basic rights, and in all of the really erratic pay schedules that, for example, like fast food workers are forced to endure. And so through unions and through organizing together, workers can gain power and influence to actually improve those worker conditions and make demands of their employers without fearing losing their jobs, or at least being able, without fear of ideally not losing their jobs. And so we're going to talk today about efforts by labor organizers to enhance job security against issues like climate change, pandemic, and weakened worker protections. So I'm Adrienne George. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a graduate student at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I am also the co-president of the TAA, the Graduate Workers Union there. And then I'll pass it to Zack Park to introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Zack Park. I use he, him pronouns. I am a Ph.D. student in biology at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. I am the former lead organizer for STEM degree programs with the Georgetown Alliance of Graduate Employees, or GAGE, which is the union that represents graduate workers here at Georgetown. And I've been organizing with GAGE for about 4 years now.
Great. Lee, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks very much. Hi, everybody. My name is Lee Anderson. I'm the Government Affairs Director for the Utility Workers Union of America, the UWUA. So I'm based out of DC, where I do legislative and policy work for the union. In one capacity or another, I've been working in, around, and for labor unions my whole professional life. Despite the fact I'm originally from Iowa, if you can believe that, I'm an actual farm boy, or I was a long time ago. But after law school and leaving all that behind, I ended up as a union side labor lawyer down south for the first part of my career, which is a whole other subject. But finally migrated to DC, got into political work, but still working, speaking out for workers and their unions, just in a different form, in a different way, which is what I've always done.
Should I go?
Yeah.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Maite Tapia. I'm an associate professor at Michigan State University. And in my teaching and my research, I mainly focus on worker voice, union organizing, community organizing, etc. So thanks, Adrienne, and thanks for NSPN for inviting me here. I'm excited about this panel.
Yeah, it's so wonderful to have all of you here today, and I can't wait to hear what you think about some of these issues. So to kind of get us started, my first question is, what is the role for academic research or science in labor policymaking and organizing? So just unmute yourself if you'd like to speak first.
Should I get started? Sure. Okay. I think to a certain extent, we can think of research that, you can use research to kind of identify certain issues in society and perhaps push for legislative action or adopting policies or evaluate policies. And some have shown that, research can influence if it's, of high quality, if it's done by reputable researchers. And then you also have to kind of see how you can kind of synthesize and translate your research into a language that is understood by policymakers, by general public, by the media, etc. So I wish I could say that kind of like my research on labor organizing has had a huge influence on policymaking, but for many of us that actually hasn't really been the case. It's really hard to kind of make that link. And what we see happening is really academics talking to each other by way of publishing in kind of high quality journals and hoping that other academics will read this. So I think what is more possible is kind of involving communities and organizations in your research. So, and then learning from each other. So for example, when the GM auto workers went on a 40-day strike in the fall of 2019, I started to visit the picket lines with my children. I had the president of the local union come and talk in my class. We built a relationship with the local union leadership. We then also surveyed the workers to understand, okay, why are they on strike, etc. So kind of building that kind of deeper relationship with local union leadership and then learning from one another. To me, that can be an important way of contributing that kind of goes beyond just academics talking to other academics.
I'll have a go with that. That was interesting, your story about the auto workers visiting picket lines. Not a lot of people do that. A lot of people might find a picket line to be a little scary. They're not really, but this was an interesting question. I thought I had to think about this one probably more than some of the others. How could scientists help labor organizers? What I thought was, it's very easy, well, everybody does it, but just to think about scientists in particular, it's very easy to focus on the problem that's right in front of you, i.e., like, how do I make this solar panel more efficient? That's the problem I'm dealing with. And the science says I need to do this. So that's what we're going to do. And that's perfectly natural. Everybody does that. And of course, scientists work that way. But I do think there's value in keeping it in mind as you're doing this work, that things don't exist in a vacuum, that they get out of the laboratory and they go into the real world, and they happen in certain ways that involve human beings. As you might imagine, our workers working for power utilities, a lot of them work in power plants, a lot of which have been closing. 10 years, many thousands of our members have lost their jobs as the coal plants have been closing. And that's been being replaced, of course, by cleaner energy, all of which we totally understand the science behind, and we understand why it has to happen. And in fact, our union came out very early in favor of a carbon price. Now, whether or not you think a carbon price is a good idea isn't the point. The point is that we're not just dug in, knuckle draggers saying this can't happen. We totally get the science, right? However, to illustrate the point, I'll use this as an example. I'm not saying we shouldn't do this. It's just that we have to think about how this happens, right? When we switch over to these new technologies, electric cars, battery storage, etc., those are made of things that are dug from the earth. They're not made with fairy dust. And unfortunately, a great deal of how that comes into being is by rare earth mining. If you Google Congolese cobalt mines, you will see what the road to a clean economy actually looks like. Now, does that mean we shouldn't do it? No, but it means we have to think about how it is done and how can we take action to remedy some of these really bad unintended consequences, right? So the point there is just simply just to realize that science alone isn't the answer. It's only part of the answer. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. Science has to be coupled with, I'll use a squishy policy from the squishy term from the mid 20th century. It has to be coupled with social policy, right? Which is maybe harder to find out than, at least I knew what it used to mean back in the mid 20th century. But that's the point. After I thought about that question for a while, science has consequences and not all of them are good. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't do them. We just have to think very carefully and thoughtfully about how we do that. That's what I would say.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the one thing I will add to those two responses is that it's okay, right, to be a scientist and to be an organizer, right, and to be an advocate, and to be political. I think, you know, we can get so siloed in, you know, our own little project, our own little thing, just like Lee was talking about. But, you know, we have to take the initiative to, you know, organize our colleagues, right? Not talk to our colleagues about things we're working on, but actually organize, right? And talk about what's going on. And we can do that. It's okay to do that, right? It's okay to do these things in addition to what you're doing in the lab. In fact, it's really important, right, to the future of the labor movement in the sciences, right? That we see ourselves as being able to do these other things and to be socially aware. You know, that's how we're really going to progress higher ed and then, you know, the science industry in general, and make it a more just and equitable place for workers.
Yeah, thank you for all of those answers. I 100% think that, like, yeah, you need to look beyond what just the science can say about labor organizing to see the intersections. Yeah, so I think, so next, I want to ask you about, like, something that Lee alluded to when talking about the clean energy stuff, which is, so how do you see climate change and climate change policy intersecting with labor rights in your work? And then kind of like, in what ways does climate change unite and or divide workers? Yeah, what is the way forward?
Unless someone else, I didn't. So I think sometimes, and indeed Lee mentioned already some of these points. I think sometimes what happens is that for example, large environmental groups, for example, are able to shut down these coal power plants, but then people might be left there without a job. And in some cases that has even meant kind of cutting off revenue, for example, for Native Indian tribes, etc. So when we think of climate change and climate change policies, that directly impacts essentially the labor market. And so as we try to move from kind of high carbon to a low carbon industry, that might mean that some jobs will be eliminated, such as coal mining in Kentucky, for example, or some might change from maybe auto to rail production, or from electric vehicles, from say conventional vehicles to electric vehicles, etc. But especially I think if we shift away kind of from fossil fuel jobs, there will be this economic impact, and that will be felt mostly by fossil fuel workers and these communities, and many of whom are already facing economic hardships. So I think it's important to pay attention and to give enough resources and a voice to kind of helping these helping these workers and these communities kind of adapt to more of a clean energy in a way that is fair and just. And often from kind of an academic point of view, we talk about that as in a sense of just transition, but it's really kind of it means really a transition to justice, because in some sense, we're actually talking about extractive practices and not just resource extraction in the sense of climate change, but we have to think broadly also, for example, thinking about the prison industrial complex, even the non-profit industrial complex, predatory lending, etc. So climate injustice is kind of a manifestation of all these existing extractive systems. So what we need is kind of a systems change, really. And so in addition to that, of course, we need to also think about how do we create then in this clean energy world kind of jobs that pay enough, that provide good benefits and so forth. And that doesn't happen automatically. So getting to these solar panels. So some companies have, for example, used prison labor to make solar panels to keep their costs low and to be able to compete against China. And same thing we have seen with some automakers like Tesla, not always kind of treating their workers well, even though we have this great electric vehicle. And we see also cases in which, for example, Black workers at Tesla have had kind of these racist experiences and so forth. So it's important to discuss essentially the labor side of it, and also to know that coal miners won't automatically just shift into solar panel workers. There's different skills that are needed for that, and that might not also be in the same kind of geographic location as in which they are. So when we think about policies, then I think it becomes important to kind of put together some kind of just transition coalition that includes kind of the local communities, that includes labor unions, that can help them with the reskilling, and that we also think we'll have to think about how we can set up kind of dedicated funding streams that can help communities transition into clean energy kind of communities and jobs, because it will take time and resources. And again, kind of that whole kind of systems change is a different kind of mindset.
I think that's my cue right there. You don't know it, of course, but you've just kind of described what I've spent the last several years of my life working on, that this is all right at the very core of my work. And it's because the members of our union have been losing their jobs. It's been right about 10 years that it's been going on. And trying to shape some sort of meaningful transition policy in response to that it's been core to what I do for a living for the last several years. And I say with complete humility that I personally and our union has been central to that discussion here in DC. I didn't intend that, I didn't set out to do that. It just kind of happened to be that way because our union, for whatever reason, has been a little bit further ahead of the game than some others in thinking about this. And so we have, over the years, crafted very specific policy responses to this issue. We've had it written into legislation that it's there right now that we're fighting like heck to see if we can get it into the so-called reconciliation package. I will tell you, though, that despite all of the work and all the support that we have in general, that it is still very much a Hail Mary pass as to whether or not this comes to be a real thing. And at the moment, it is not a real thing. There's no such thing as transition policy, quote unquote, in the world now. And unless we get something passed in this next big bill, there will continue to not be any such thing. And you surprised me a little bit again there. You seem to be very aware of some of these issues. A lot of people have it in their mind that you walk out of the coal plant one day and the next day you get a job over on the solar farm, which is utterly ridiculous. That never happens. That's not a thing. There are many reasons for that. You named a couple, geography, skill sets. But there are lots of reasons why that doesn't happen. People just find themselves in the economy and they have the skills that they have. They're where they are in life in terms of age and family, where they live, all these things that are going on in their life direct them to make certain decisions. And that doesn't have anything to do with the fact that they are working in the quote energy industry. And so therefore they should continue working in the energy industry. Why? Right? That's just not how it works. It's a very lazy way of thinking. I'm at risk of answering this question at great length if you let me. So I don't want to do that. I don't want to chew up all the time. I will simply say, you are right. You are very right. Transition policy is desperately needed. We don't have it. If we don't get it, it's going to continue to be a mess. And then the final point I'll make, and I'll shut up before I burn down too much time, is that it doesn't take much imagination to understand how divisive these issues are with our membership. Everything that you have in life literally comes from the hydrocarbon industry, whether you work in a coal plant or gas plant or whatever. Not only do you have one of the best blue collar jobs in the economy, you have one of the best jobs, period, in the economy. A lot of these folks make more than I do. And that's the result of 80 years of collective bargaining. And you can't just flip a switch and replace that somehow. The new technologies that are coming up, yes, there are jobs there, some, not very many, and they're much lower quality because they're almost 100% non-union. Like I say, I could go on for an hour, but I don't want to burn down the call, so I better stop there.
Zach, do you have anything you want to add, or do you want to? Okay, cool.
That was beautiful.
Lovely. Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for those responses. Yeah, this is just a great conversation and I'm really enjoying it. So I think, so in terms of the pandemic, how has the pandemic affected the unions you work with or research, and the broader labor movement? What changes are, and maybe what changes are the most exciting for you to see?
Start with this one. So, the pandemic has brought many challenges, right? And as grad workers, we kind of are at this place in the higher ed industrial complex where we're not often thought about that often, right? We're not really paying tuition. We're kind of doing really cheap labor. We're very easily overlooked by administrative decisions, and so this pandemic has definitely highlighted that, and it's definitely been a fight, right, in our members. They were concerned, right, at the start of the pandemic. It was, we were going to be back in person in the fall and, in classrooms and teaching back in the labs, and people were scared, right? They didn't want to go back into the classroom right away, but it didn't seem like that was going to be an option for TAs and RAs the way that it might have been for faculty members. So this pandemic has definitely highlighted the need to really build power in your union, right? To make sure that when these situations arise, you're able to mobilize quickly to make sure that your needs and the things you're concerned about are addressed by the employer. And of course, there are ways to do that, right? Here at Georgetown, we engaged in impact bargaining because of the pandemic, which is something that unions can do through their collective bargaining agreement. And this was something that happened at grad unions kind of across the country. And also you're seeing it now with teachers unions as well, right? Who are, fighting for better working conditions in their schools to make sure that kids are able to go back to school safe. You might have been recently following the strike of Scranton teachers about some of these issues. And so that's, kind of how it's impacted the broader labor movement, right? It's really highlighted where employers are failing us in making sure that we're safe in any possible condition that we might be working in. And that's kind of allowed for this blossom of people being involved in their unions, right? In union organizing, especially in higher ed, which has really been awesome to see, right? And I think that that's the thing that I'm most excited about is, this people they're mad about their working conditions and they want to do something about them. And they have this outlet in joining the union, right? And, just thinking about, Student Researchers United at the UCal system just voted 97.5% yes to authorize a strike, one of the largest unions in higher ed in the country. This is power, this is worker power. And the pandemic has highlighted how bad things are. And so hopefully we can get that union density nationwide percentage up to where it used to be a long time ago.
I love your optimism. I think that's a great goal and I share it. The pandemic has been very challenging for our members. At the outset, it became quickly apparent just how invisible some of these things are in modern life, the things that absolutely underpin modern life. The reason we're having this call, you know, the groups of workers who tended to not get classified as essential workers were folks in power plants and water treatment plants and the folks at the gas utility. And they thought, well, should we turn these things off and just go home? Would anybody mind if we turned off the power and the water? And of course, that's silly. What it really illustrated is that it works so well and it is so invisible that people just don't think about it at all, right? If you travel abroad, you know, where some of these things are not reliable, you think about it, right? You think about whether there's power or not, but we don't in America. And that's maybe a victim of the success of that infrastructure over a century, right? And that does not, of course, take away from the people who were classified as essential workers. Obviously, they were, and this isn't crabs in a bucket. They were essential, and so are our members, and so are a great many other members who never came up. But the point is, our members in these industries are invisible, so it's easy for people to not think about them on a variety of topics, right? But also, because they were essential, they couldn't turn the power plant off and go home. A great many of them, of course, got COVID, and a great many of them died. For a while there, our national safety director's, one of his main duties was keeping track of how many members had died. And this, of course, was pre-vaccine and everything. The bright spot in that mess in the early going there was our locals, who did what local unions do. They went to the table with the company and they bargained specific agreements over how we're going to do this, right? Distancing, masks, the availability of hand cleansers, all of those things were bargained and put into a contract, actually rather rapidly, you know, 2, 4, 6 weeks, depending on the situation, doing very old-fashioned 20th century work that nobody would ever know about, or, you know, who would ever even know that happened. And so in those shops, there were procedures very early on. But to your point about density, power gen is, by US standards, a relatively high union density sector. It's about 20-ish%, which compared to 6% in the general private economy is unbelievable, right? Though, of course, by global standards, it's still very low. But the point is, that's just 20%. The other 80% is non-union. And the Lord only knows how things went in those shops. If some individual person was concerned, well, toughy lucky. What are you going to go do? Walk into your boss's office and demand justice? No, you're going to get fired, right? That's the power of a union. That's the power of collective bargaining. And that crisis is the biggest crisis, you know, maybe we'll ever see in our lives. The local unions came through because that's what they do every day. They solve problems. Last point I'll make is that it has also been challenging because it's been almost indescribably politically divisive in all of the ways that you see playing out, that we all see playing out in the media every day. You know, on those shop floors, it's just like that, just down at the individual level. This half of the shop thinks that, and this half of the shop thinks that. It's been an unhappy, hard, challenging experience all the way through, but the union infrastructure, the union apparatus has acted to do what it can and what it always does, which is to bargain to protect the health and safety of our members.
Yeah, I agree. These are both really good points, Zach and Lee. And just very briefly to add, I would think that perhaps something to be excited in a way about is that workers are now kind of showing their power. You know, they might not work, you know, we think, you know, do we still want to work for employers that pay kind of very little, bad schedules, no benefits, etc. So during the pandemic, we've seen many strikes. There were these strike trackers. There were over 1,000 strikes by union and non-union workers, you know, to demand hazard pay, sick leave, protective gear, etc. But also we see it happening now. So we see people talked about Striketober. So in October, there's been many strikes, and maybe that's still going on now, Strike November somehow, you know, workers at John Deere, Kellogg's, etc., that are realizing, you know, that we do have collective power. But I agree with Lee that there's a big split in terms of if you were unionized versus not, and of course the majority in our country is not. Then the pandemic had huge consequences on your jobs and on your life. And there's people through surveys also, it's shown clear how they were much more protective if they were part of a union, as they could bargain, as Zack also mentioned, and Lee as well, for better safety measures, etc.
Yeah, thank you all. So now we're going to turn to some audience questions, and here's another encouragement from me, your moderator, to, like, if you have questions, please submit them to the Q&A. Yeah, so we'll start with one from the committee chairs. So Lee, are there any ways that scientists in particular can help advocate for a just energy transition for your union members? Is there data analysis needed, or scientific literature that needs to be summarized, or something else? Thank you for participating this man.
Good question. As it happens, I have an actual scientist for a friend. He's a fellow, well, he actually just changed to a different job, but for many years he worked at the Union of Concerned Scientists. So he was an actual scientist working at a scientific organization. And he and I partnered up and did a paper that did a lot of what you just said. He did actual data analysis, because that's his background, to describe the problem set, right? Who are these workers exactly? Where are they? You know, where do they live, et cetera? Where do they work? You would think that that data would be out there and readily available with a Google search. It is not. He basically created an algorithm to derive that from existing Bureau of Labor Statistics data and mapped it literally where everybody is. You know, people always think, coal, that's a West Virginia problem. That's one place. It's actually pretty much everywhere. Coal-fired power plants in particular are in every state. Coal mines are almost in every state, certainly they were. And having done that, and then being able to put that in front of policymakers, that completely changed the story, right? Suddenly there were a great many more people who understood that their localities, their regions had a stake in this, so that it wasn't all just about, you know, sad Appalachia. This is something that undergirds the entire national economy. So that is how, to answer your question, a scientist really did help us. You know, just because I work for the union and I represent these members doesn't mean that I have the skill set to do those sorts of things, right? I don't. He's a master of spreadsheets is what he is. And he did a very good job of it. Don't underestimate that. I mean, so much of policy making, well, okay, this is the second thing, and then I'll stop talking again. If it's done correctly, data always underpins solid policy making, right? I mean, there's always the papers go back and forth from the left-wing think tanks and the right-wing think tanks. You always wonder whether the numbers are cooked. But as long as you do the numbers as straight as you possibly can without cooking them, that is always going to inform good policy making, always.
Thank you. So our next question is, so some economists and left-wing activists have been advocating for a job guarantee, a government guarantee of a job at $15 an hour and benefits doing useful work within one's community with access to training and development opportunities. Do you think such a policy would be a good idea to protect workers during the energy transition?
I feel like that's directed at me, but I do not mean to completely hog the call if somebody else wants to go there. There's a lot packed into that question. First of all, the reason why some people need $15 an hour, obviously, is because they make a lot less, which is pitiful. But by historical standards, $15 an hour is still not even minimum wage. It should be something more like 25 bucks an hour to be equal to what it was when they first created the minimum wage back in the day, which just shows how far the bar has fallen and how low Americans' expectations really are, right? Not to say some people don't need $15 an hour, because they sure do, because right now they're working for 8 and 9 bucks an hour, right? But that's not the point. The point is everybody needs to have the bar raised way higher than that. In our industry in particular, if you said you were making $15 an hour, they'd say you have a bad job. You need to get a better job. And I don't mean that disparagingly. This is why this is a difficult question to answer, because I know there are so many people working under $15 who are desperate, but even 15 is not enough. And I understand the point about a government job guarantee. You know, I'm a fan of the WPA and everything that happened in the early 20th century. Again, don't get me wrong, but it does sort of supplant actual worker empowerment, right? We had high union density in like the 50s and 60s, not because of government job guarantees, but because workers were empowered and had very strong labor unions, right? The way that we raise the bar for everybody and get it way above $15 an hour is by directly empowering the workers, you know, across the economy to really bargain to where they really should be. I mean, if wages are where they were, you know, during that time period, $50 or in the 50s and 60s, I don't know how to express it. We've just, the bar has fallen so low, expectations have fallen so low, people don't even really remember what a good middle class job really is. And the only way I see to get that back is to empower the workforce.
Yeah, that's very true. Would either of our other panelists like to add to that?
I'll just add there is other legislation that's being tried, right, called the Protect the Right to Organize Act, or the PRO Act, right, which kind of updates you know, previous labor laws and makes them more worker friendly. Because I think what Lee said is absolutely true, right? I think everything he described, right? People in these industries are making more than $15 an hour now. So if all you can guarantee them is a job at $15 an hour, where they're taking probably a massive pay cut in a lot of cases, then how are they going to get behind this transition to clean energy? And, you know, we really need to move forward together. And the way to do that, right, is through organizing through these labor unions. And so if we have a mechanism where we can really strengthen the right to organize in this country and really solidify the safety of organizers, right, of people who go out of their way to try to organize a union in an industry and not face retaliation from an employer, you know, we can make huge wins. And also, right, unions aren't just restricted to bargaining over, you know, workplace benefits and things like that. There's lots of unions that do things called bargaining for the common good. And so that's an opportunity where labor unions can step in and they can make big changes in communities through their ability to collectively bargain with, you know, these massive companies.
Well, just to build on that, I would say, so the PRO Act could be one way of kind of facilitating unionization, but still, when that is, you know, not sure if that will pass actually. And so when we talk to workers, for example, a lot would say, you know, it's great if there were changes in labor laws, but if we will have to wait for that, we'll have to wait forever. So while that in terms of kind of policy would be good, there's also, we see that workers have been organizing with or without the support of traditional unions to pressure employers to make changes. We saw that during COVID, we see that still now. And so I think there's an appetite in a way of for collective action as a way for improving your working conditions, essentially. but it's hard. And as there was just a whole 20-minute thing on union busting and the John Oliver show, you know, it shows how kind of the power is very much with the employer here in the US. And so as long as we have that unchecked corporate power, it's very hard to kind of build that kind of counterforce because the odds are very much always in their favor to win these campaigns.
That's a great transition into our next audience question, which are, what are ways to achieve large-scale sectoral bargaining within the economy, as opposed to unions that only cover workers within a specific workplace or company?
Well, again, I feel like that's directed at me, but let me connect it to the comments that were just made about the PRO Act. There are pieces of the PRO Act that have been put into the so-called reconciliation package that we're all breathlessly waiting for. It is not the entire PRO Act. It is a couple of things that have to do with penalties for things that companies do illegally during organizing drives. Those are non-trivial points for sure, because the penalties right now are trivial and companies will just blow right by them because they don't care. And so if we actually got those penalties, that would be super, but those are just a couple of lines in the PRO Act, right? The PRO Act is basically a wholesale rewrite of American labor law. That is not what is in the reconciliation package, nor could it be because of the arcane rules of the Senate. And really, once you start talking about things like sectoral bargaining, like they have in Europe, that's what you would be, just throwing out American labor law and just start over from scratch is what you would do, right? Now, having said that, there has been forms of sectoral bargaining in the US before, a lot of which were broken apart by good old-fashioned union busting. I can think of a few examples in my own career. There used to be, when they call them pattern agreements, some people may know what that is, where they'll have an agreement that covers, you know, all of these paper mills in, 10 different states, right? Or they'll have a master contract for every over-the-road car hauler in the United States, right? Those are sectoral in the sense that they cover not entire industries, but very large chunks of industries. But those are just built over decades by old-fashioned collective bargaining, in the 30s up through the 70s or maybe 80s. But then most of those got broken apart, in the Reagan years and after by just union busting. There are places where the unions are trying to bring those back, but it's very hard because American labor law is terrible. So I'm kind of over answering the question, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, and I would say even if we go to Europe, where they have in some countries sectoral bargaining, even there, because of kind of push towards neoliberal policies, there's a push that pushes collective bargaining agreements down also more and more to kind of the company level. So while there has been some debate here in the US about we should have, or kind of the dream of having this sectoral bargaining, it's not that likely to actually happen. And as Lee mentioned, there were some cases through pattern bargaining in which you can reach a broader population of the industry, but we're going much more into a company kind of level.
Thank you. Okay, I think for like I think I'm going to do one kind of last broader question, which is, in the face of all of these challenges that we've talked about, like, what are the most important paths for change in labor rates right now? And what are the potential risks? And maybe let's start with Zack.
I think, important paths are to, if you feel like your workplace is not working for you, there's a chance that somebody else feels the same. And so I think, kind of like what we've discussed over the previous questions, it's going to be really hard to get broad sweeping labor reform through the Congress for the foreseeable future. So the best thing we can do is to take the initiative to try and organize our workplaces and to talk to our colleagues about workplace conditions, right? We are still protected from that, right? You can ask somebody else how much money they're making, right? There are protected things. And so, there are some labor laws that are protecting us, right? That are good. And so let's take advantage of them, right? Let's start organizing our colleagues and let's start engaging in collective action. And then the more we normalize unionization across the country and people start to realize the benefits of unionization, then it becomes so much easier to get broad sweeping things through the Congress, because we can start to then really challenge politicians on both sides of the aisle, with re-election loss or whatever it has to be, in order to get these things done for workers. So, I think, right, the path is just to start having one-on-one conversations, right, organizing conversations with folks, and building power.
Could you add just a little bit more about specifically on campus and kind of academic workers? And because there's often a kind of, anti-union sentiment, or just oh, you don't need, I don't know, you're a researcher, why would I join a union?
Yeah. There's definitely, right, the I have it good argument. You will find people that's what they'll say to you. But you'll find people that say something totally different, right? That are having a workplace issue and they don't know how to address it. And then you start talking to them and you start talking about, okay, well, here's one possible way we can fix it. And then they say, oh, well, I have, 3 other people in my department who are having the same issue. And then before you know it, right, you have a supermajority of people who want to be recognized by a union. And it's weird at first, but I think if you start within your department, right, which is usually someplace where we all have at least some people we feel comfortable talking with, start having the conversations with them. And then you can sort of build out, right, this union community through these organizing conversations, and it gets less and less difficult, right, to find people who are having issues and who could really benefit from the support of a union. I think that the one big hindrance in higher ed, and I think that this is at every level, right, from grad students to faculty, is they keep us really busy. It's okay, we should be really busy just doing our work, right? But there's a reason why they're keeping us so busy. It's so we don't try to exercise our rights as workers. And so we don't even actualize ourselves as workers. So take the time, right? Have lunch with someone and just talk about what their experience is like. And before you know it, right, you have a collective bargaining agreement and have guaranteed 2% raises for the next 3 years. And it all started just, by a lunchroom chat.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Well, I'll have a go at that. I really like that answer. You were illustrating some very important things there that I wanted to touch on. Look, the time and place that I grew up, everybody was working class. You were a farmer or a truck driver, or you worked in a factory, you worked physically, you got dirty, you took a shower at the end of the day. They're the sorts of folks who people, now today living in the city would look at and say, those are working class people. Well, I'm not working class. Well, yes, you are. And this is what I would say. I love the answer you just gave, because it was illustrating a point that has been lost over the decades. And it's kind of gotten to be almost impolite to say it in modern society, but I'm going to say it right now. What we need to get back is a sense of class consciousness. If you trade your time and your skills for wages, you are working class, no matter what you think. Because you work in an office and don't get dirty and you go home and watch Netflix, you think you're not working class, you are. I'm working class. Despite law school and being a lobbyist and all that nonsense, degrees don't impress me at all, right? I'm a working class slob. I trade my time for wages, right? And that is what, as you were describing, I loved your answer. That's what brings people together, in the faculty break room. When they all realize that what they have in common with each other, just, this guy's in English and that guy's in math and whatever, they're all working class folks on that campus. They're all trading their time and their skills to an employer for wages. I know that makes me sound hopeless of the 20th century. And in fairness, Lyndon Johnson was president when I was born. It's true. But that's the foundation of the labor movement, right? There are classes, whether we like it or not. And if we don't say them out loud, they don't go away. They're still there, right? There's a certain segment of the population, I'll say to the right of me, who definitely don't want us to talk in terms of class consciousness. That really makes them upset and nervous. What you described, though, I could see it. I could see it in those break rooms. The light goes on in their head, like, wait a minute, we're all being exploited in one particular way, right? We're all working class. So that's the point I wanted to make, and I think that you illustrated it with your example.
Yeah, and I also love Zach's optimism of, you make it sound very easy. You just talk to each other, but this is indeed kind of, you start these one-on-one conversations to start to unionize, but at the same time, especially also in higher ed, many grad students, faculty, etc., have tried that, and often it hasn't led to a successful, unionization vote. And partially that is, again, because the university or administration will kind of try to do everything they can to kind of stop that. Apart from keeping us busy, we're also very siloed. It's not that we have in higher ed, we don't really have a break room in which a math professor talks with a social scientist, right? We're all very much in our silos. And so breaking through that and intentionally building those relationships and looking for spaces in which we can meet each other and talk about these issues is definitely going to be a first step towards collectivizing our power around certain issues. And we're trying that to a certain extent now at Michigan State. And it's a really, really long process. So we'll see where it ends, if it works.
One more thing I just want to add quickly, in particular thinking about graduate workers and even postdoctoral fellows, is that in a lot of states, we're not really classified as workers, right? There's these state ordinances, right, where you're just not classified as a worker. One way, right, if you're interested in trying to get a policy solidified, right, is to get the National Labor Relations Board to solidify their ruling that graduate workers are in fact workers and they're employees and they're entitled to the rights of employees. So if you're interested in a policy piece that could really help the labor movement, that's one, because it opens up a whole big sector across the nation to unionizing.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Yeah, that's something we started with here in Wisconsin for a little bit different reason, but it does come down to that in part. So thank you all for this wonderful panel. We're a few minutes over, but everybody just had such lovely things to say. So I know I'm really inspired by the work all of you are doing, the work that we all can do. So I hope all of our participants go out and start unions if you don't already have one, wherever you're working right now. Thank you so much, and have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.